Metroid Prime was released for the GameCube in 2002 and developed by Retro Studios. During Nintendo's first jump into 3D graphics with the Nintendo 64, the Metroid franchise was nowhere to be seen, with its last release being Super Metroid on the SNES. Instead, the future of the Metroid series was put into the hands of rookie developer Retro Studios. Collaborating with Nintendo, Retro started work on Metroid Prime, using the power of the GameCube's hardware to finally bring Samus into the third dimension. Despite initial fears over its first-person perspective and development team, the game released to near-perfect review scores and huge amounts of praise from fans and critics. In this video, I'm going to be discussing Metroid Prime in depth, so spoilers for the entire game are present throughout.
The cosmos. In the vast universe, the history of humanity is but a flash of light from a lone star. The life of a single person should be lost in space and time. But among the stars, there is one light that burns brighter than all others. The light of Samus Aran. Her battles extend beyond her life and etch themselves into history. Here, another chapter of that history will be written.
The game opens with a cutscene following Samus on her way to investigating a distress signal broadcasting from a derelict spacecraft. We get a full view of Samus and her ship from all angles, showing just how much care and attention to detail has been put into recreating the iconic bounty hunter. Considering that you spend the majority of the game staring down Samus's arm cannon, Retro seem to have spent a surprising amount of time getting her full model just right. The basic sharp geometry of her suit lends itself to the graphical limits of the GameCube, with less polygons being needed to stay true to her original design. This brief opening cinematic sets the scene nicely, without overstaying its welcome, playing for all of 2 minutes before handing the controls over to the player. The Space Pirate Frigate serves as a tutorial, demonstrating the essential components of Prime's gameplay in a straightforward, self-contained level. The first thing you shoot here isn't an enemy, but a series of switches that deactivates a force field. This demonstrates how to lock onto targets and also explains that the arm cannon is used to interact with doors and switches and isn't just an offensive weapon. Scanning is shown off immediately afterwards and is required to pass through another force field before entering the research station. I suppose the use of on-screen text prompts here could be seen as immersion breaking, but considering that the control scheme of Prime uses every single button on the GameCube controller, I'd argue that their use is more than warranted. A small reminder that you are in fact playing a video game is harmless, especially in these first opening minutes. After an admittedly poorly disguised tutorial, the atmosphere is quickly re-established upon entering the first door. The broken metallic hallways of the Space Pirate Research Station are littered with flickering holograms displaying hints of science gone horribly wrong. It's not long before you find parasites feeding off the remains of space pirates, all killed in one horrific way or another. Acid spills, spine fractures, brain damage, pretty much anything that could go wrong went wrong. It's a heavily atmospheric setting that makes for one hell of an opening level, and it's a masterclass in environmental storytelling. Gigantic alien corpses lie in front of their broken test tubes, escape pods are missing, and fire bursts out of broken equipment. You don't need the scan visor to tell you that something's gone wrong here, and this is something that is present in all of the environments you explore throughout the game. A meticulous attention to detail within the level design gives each area a strong sense of place, and every region has its own story to tell. The level continues on with its tutorial structure, leading the player into a hidden map room to explain the benefits of going off the beaten path and throwing them into some light combat with weakened space pirates and automatic turrets. This all concludes with the boss battle against the Parasite Queen. It's a fairly basic fight that lets you get accustomed to locking on and strafing, as well as laying down the basic structure that most of the game's boss fights follow. You're taught to scan the boss to learn its weakness, and then wait for the right moment to exploit that weakness and deal some damage. As first bosses go, it's par for the course in its difficulty, and it does a good job of teaching the player how to handle these encounters. Defeating the Parasite Queen triggers an exciting escape sequence heavily reminiscent of Super Metroid's opening minutes.
Evacuate immediately. Evacuate immediately.
This sums up the tutorial nicely, pitting the player's knowledge against a frantic dash through the collapsing research station. Anyone who's played this sequence more than once will know that there's plenty of time given to escape, but the constant view of the timer and the rapidly beating soundtrack manage to instill a sense of panic with every playthrough. The brief encounter with Ridley is what really drives this feeling of dread home. His new design is fantastically menacing, and although you only see him for a few seconds, it's clear from this scene that he's going to become a much bigger problem later on. Fans of the franchise already know how persistent and ruthless Ridley is, and his sheer size and intimidating appearance is enough to get this across to newcomers of the series. A few moments later sees Samus launched backwards and stripped of her powers and upgrades. This is a classic example of what's become known as the abilities trope, where the player is given a brief taste of their character's full potential before the game takes it away. In the case of Metroid Prime, it serves as motivation to explore, find the lost upgrades, and reclaim the strength you had at the beginning, which is fair enough. However, I find it hard to believe that Samus's power suit malfunctions after being knocked back by an explosion. Her armor is built to withstand battles against humongous alien creatures, extreme environments, and all sorts of weaponry, so losing most of her suit's functionality after a concussive blast leaves this section feeling kind of silly. I realise I'm nitpicking here, but it gives the impression that the developers needed a reason for players to explore but couldn't quite figure out how to execute it properly. Either way, after successfully escaping the collapsing frigate, Samus frantically runs to her ship to give chase to Ridley, who has fled to the planet Talon 4. This is where the game finally opens up, sinking the player into a rich, diverse world to explore. It's here that Metroid Prime starts to live up to its promises, and it does so wonderfully. The moment you regain control over Samus, a triumphant chorus of trumpets, strings, and choirs set the scene, inspiring the player to explore and discover everything that Talon 4 has to offer. Thick sheets of raindrops scatter off Samus's arm cannon and gently rest on her visor, giving the world a tactile and believable aesthetic. The Talon overworld is a beautifully gloomy place, with its rich span of plant life and deep pools of water creating a place that feels comfortably Earth-like, its more alien aspects lying with the creatures that call this place home. The general goal from this point is to find and collect the upgrades and enhancements that were lost back on the frigate, and you're let loose onto Talon 4 to explore with very little direction, which is of course one of the main characteristics of the Metroid franchise. The transition from Super Metroid's two-dimensional environments to Prime's three-dimensional ones brought with it the risk of intimidating the player by simply giving them too much ground to cover. You could argue that getting lost is part of the experience, which is a fair point, but the fact remains that getting lost for long stretches of time can tire even the most stubborn of explorers. Retro Studios solved this problem in a number of ways, all of which combine to create an open world where you're free to get lost but never lose focus. The main active ingredient is level design. The game rarely allows the player to walk too far without reaching some kind of barrier, such as a door they can't open yet or a hole they can't roll through. But there are small upgrades dotted around these paths that lead to temporary dead ends. The frustration of having to turn back and walk for ages to simply try a different route is removed, and the player is often rewarded for their time with a missile upgrade or energy tank. The sense of discovery remains intact, and you can happily move on more powerful than you were to start off with. The other core element is the intuitive three-dimensional map that can be accessed at any time and comfortably sits in the top right corner of the heads-up display. Even at a quick glance, it's incredibly easy to read. Explored areas are coloured a bright orange and unexplored areas are coloured with neon blue. These colours contrast each other but don't clash, creating a colour scheme that's easy on the eyes and also easy to understand. Doors are also marked with bright colours, so there's no mistaking where you can and can't go. The player's position on the map is marked with a large green arrow with a red tip. This makes it easy to orientate yourself when switching between the map screen and the gameplay, which is something you'll be doing often. The third and perhaps most obvious feature is the hint system, which manages to guide the player without holding their hand. Spending too long without making progress will trigger an alert on the screen warning Samus of various things, such as environmental anomalies and strange wildlife activity. Responding to the alert quickly brings up the map screen and highlights where you should be heading towards. What's great about this system is that it only displays the room you should be in and never highlights the path to take. You're given a general direction but not forced to follow it, keeping the feeling of freedom and exploration. It's a simple but elegant solution to the problem of new players being turned off by an overwhelming map, and if you prefer a less guided experience, there's an option to turn the hint system off entirely. With these three design features in place, Metroid Prime becomes accessible to several kinds of players without compromising its core gameplay. There's a fair amount of doors to go through in the first area, but the way to the Chozo ruins is quickly determined thanks to the use of well-placed progression barriers. The Chozo ruins are introduced with a short cutscene. A few sweeping camera shots tell the story of a once great city taken over by sand, its pillars crumbling under their own weight. Indigenous wildlife has claimed the ruined sanctuary for itself, with beetles swarming through their underground tunnels and wasps nesting in the cracks of ancient city walls. The story of the ruins is told through Chozo lore etched into these walls, and their secrets can be deciphered using the scan visor. This is how the game conveys its entire story, leaving it up to the player to scan the environment and read through it themselves. It's a fantastic method of storytelling, and it keeps that distinct isolation and loneliness that the Metroid franchise has become known for. It also frees up considerable development time to work on fine-tuning and polishing the gameplay. Cutscenes certainly have their place, but it's definitely not in Metroid Prime. Time and money could have been spent telling the history of Talon 4 through flashbacks or something similar, but I feel that the scan logs are a perfect vessel for the game's narrative. The scan visor itself is a wonderful mechanic, and it lets the developers indulge in some serious world building. Pretty much anything that might pique your interest has a scannable node attached to it, containing information on how that machine works, what purpose those monitors serve, or what's in that giant test tube. The only problem I have with the scan visor is entirely personal, but I still feel it's worth mentioning. I'm sure it was the full intent of the developers to create a world where players want to scrutinize every last room for information, but personally I find it to break the flow of gameplay at times. If you're anything like me, a large part of your first playthrough is spent looking through the scan visor almost constantly, anxiously scanning everything for fear of missing it and not being able to come back. Despite this, I still think it's a great way of immersing yourself into the game, and it also allows for players to skip over the story and play entirely at their own pace should they want to. Anyway, the first visit to the Chozo ruins is essentially a series of 3 mini-boss fights, each of which reward you with a piece of equipment you lost back on the space pirate Frigate. Arguably one of the most important of these 3 upgrades is the Morph Ball. It's been said that Retro initially had difficulties creating a seamless transition from first to third person camera angles, and that Shigeru Miyamoto made it clear that if they couldn't perfect this, the Morph Ball would have to be scrapped entirely. Thankfully, they managed to pull it off perfectly, and the resulting transition is flawless. Rolling into Morph Ball mode is intuitive, and your sense of direction and place within the environment is left completely intact. Controlling a sphere within a 3D space feels completely natural, which makes using the Morph Ball fun and responsive. It's also one of the most versatile upgrades in the game, allowing you to roll through small spaces, boost to reach higher speeds, bomb jump, blow up certain obstacles, and eventually stick to magnetized railings. It's clear that Retro wanted to get the most out of the Morph Ball, and since it's one of the most iconic features in the franchise, I think it was well worth the effort. The 4th upgrade acquired in the Chozo ruins along with the missile launcher and Morph Ball bombs is the Charge Beam. Charging the arm cannon not only increases its damage, but also acts as a means to collect distant health and ammo drops. It's a nice feature that removes the tedium of having to walk or jump all the way to a small health unit, and generally streamlines the gameplay. Once you've gained the Charge Beam, you're now sufficiently equipped to enter the chamber containing the game's second boss, Flagra. This mutated, twisted incarnation of Talon 4's native plant life draws its power from the sun, and this is the key to its defeat. The player must lift the solar panels to weaken it, and then use the Morph Ball bombs to take it down from the inside. It's a conceptually interesting mechanic, although I feel it falls flat in its execution. There's little more to this fight than locking onto Flagra, strafing around the chamber and hitting the solar panels, repeating the process a few times until it dies. The sheer size of this thing is impressive though, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't intimidated by Flagra my first time facing it. The soundtrack does a great job of building tension, and its visual design is pretty terrifying. What's interesting about Flagra is that it's something of a red herring. A piece of Chozo lore in the room just before the boss alludes to a meteor crashing into the planet, creating a wave of poison that left much of the world in ruins. Given that there's an abundance of poisoned water in the Chozo ruins, and that defeating Flagra cleanses these waters, it's not unreasonable to initially assume that Flagra was brought to the planet on the meteor, and was the source of the corruption. Beating the boss lures the player into a false sense of achievement, and for a few moments they might think that they've defeated some great evil that was the plight of the Chozo ruins. A room just after the boss chamber contains lore that goes into greater detail about the poison, and explains that Flagra is simply one of the many creatures affected by the corruption. Reading this for the first time, I distinctly remember a sinking feeling that gave the impression that I was up against something far more powerful than a mutated plant. It's a great little detail that further demonstrates how effective Prime's storytelling can be. So, with the second boss defeated, you're rewarded with the Varia suit, and it's time to head down into Magmoor caverns. The searing hot lava-filled chambers of Magmoor caverns lend a distinctly volatile and dangerous edge to exploration. The first-person perspective is used to fantastic effect here, with plumes of steam forming water droplets onto Samus's visor and a constant red haze wrapping around the scenery. Perhaps the most notable feature of Magmoor Caverns is its music, which is a wonderful reinterpretation of Lower Norfair's theme from Super Metroid. As a fairly new studio working on such a beloved franchise, I'd imagine that there was plenty of temptation to reference the previous Metroid titles as fanservice. Thankfully, Retro took just enough liberties to make Metroid Prime nostalgic without making it obnoxious. Small hints towards the previous games are few and far between, obvious to fans of the series but subtle enough to not get in the way of the experience. Lower Norfair's theme fits Magmoor Caverns nicely, and has a similar rhythm to Samus's footsteps. I can't say if this was deliberate or not, but it's a nice touch either way. A prominent aspect of both Magmoor Caverns and Chozo Ruins is that many of their rooms are centered around platforming. Generally speaking, platforming in first person is considered to be cumbersome, but Metroid Prime handles it brilliantly. Jumping from platform to platform is smooth, reliable and responsive, due in no small part to the ability to lock your view downwards by pressing the left trigger. This gives you full control of your field of view, and you'll always be able to see the ledge you're jumping to clearly. Samus also has a great degree of control in midair, allowing some room for mistakes just in case you slightly mistimed a jump or overestimated your trajectory. The brief time spent in the caverns is used to good effect, slowly ramping up the challenge as well as introducing the player to more threatening hostile creatures. The first venture through here is short, and largely serves as a connecting hub between the Chozo Ruins and Phendrana drifts. The glacial ruins and frost-ridden landscapes of Phendrana are a burst of fresh air after a brief journey through the sweltering, almost claustrophobic Magmoor caverns. An ominous piano piece complements the light snowfall in what is perhaps one of the best examples of atmosphere in video games. Phendrana is set up to be a peaceful place, with most of its creatures passively going about their routines. This gives heavy weight to the discovery of space pirate structures crammed into the various cave systems tunneling through the drifts. Disturbance in the natural balance is one of the main themes throughout Metroid Prime's narrative, with the space pirates carelessly tearing through previously undisturbed landscapes in the name of science and galactic domination. It's this stark contrast between mysterious ancient ruins and industrial alien technology that makes the space pirates easy to hate, and fighting them is all the more satisfying. An interesting small touch in Phendrana is a piece of Chozo lore entitled The Entrusted One. This logbook entry talks about a prophesied savior, and how the Chozo have left their weapons and armor to be discovered by the one who can reverse the damage caused by the meteor. It provides a logical reason as to why there are upgrades scattered around the planet, and makes it easier for the player to suspend their disbelief. This initial visit to the drift sees the player grabbing the boost ball, which provides a faster alternative to walking as well as a solution to some particularly fun half-pipe puzzles. The area that contains the boost ball has a large half-pipe that you'll have to utilize in order to leave the room, allowing you to play around with this new upgrade and understand how it works. This is something of a design staple in the Metroid series, as well as many other games that follow this kind of formula. The game will force the player to use a new upgrade in order to progress, which eliminates the risk of players not fully understanding what they just obtained. You'll likely be itching to try out a new power-up anyway, so this design feature also provides some instant satisfaction. Leaving the Boost Ball Canyon to return to the save station triggers a small encounter with Ridley, in a very literal case of foreshadowing. It's a great little cutscene that serves as a haunting reminder that Ridley is still out there, and it's a nice bit of motivation to keep the story moving at a steady pace. After obtaining the Boost Ball, the player has to backtrack to the Talon overworld to find the space jump boots. Backtracking is one of the few things in Metroid Prime that is often heavily criticised, but compared to many other games I think it's done fairly well. There's almost always something new to find, either in the form of an upgrade or a logbook entry that gives more insight into the story. At its best, it rewards exploration. At its worst, it has the player going back through the entire span of Talon 4 to find artifacts, but I'll get to that later. I will say that the backtracking does begin to feel tedious on repeat playthroughs, and the addition of some kind of fast travel mechanic would have done wonders to remove the tedium. The ability to teleport between save stations, for example, would have not only smoothed out the experience, but would have also felt plausible within the Metroid universe. As it is though, the player is required to spend a significant amount of time retreading their steps. Collecting various upgrades opens up small shortcuts through certain areas, but I still feel that more time could have been spent designing some way around the excessive backtracking. With the space jump boots acquired, it's back to Phendrana drifts to find the first weapon upgrade. The Sheegoth guarding the wave beam crashes onto the scene and initially seems pretty frightening, but much like Flagra, this fight consists of strafing around the boss, waiting for an opening and then dealing some damage. The wave beam is one of 3 weapon upgrades you'll find in the game, and as well as being able to unlock certain doors, each of these adds a layer of variety to the combat. The wave beam stuns enemies, the ice beam lets you freeze and then shatter enemies, and the plasma beam pretty much melts anything it touches. When it comes to discussing Metroid Prime, people are often quick to call it a first-person adventure game as opposed to a first-person shooter. Whilst Prime certainly has a heavy emphasis on careful exploration over combat, I still think the shooting mechanics are well worth talking about. To put it simply, I think that the combat in Metroid Prime is nothing short of fantastic. Locking onto enemies and quickly dashing around them is exciting, and firing the arm cannon is incredibly responsive. The standard power beam will fire as quickly as you can hit the A button, making you feel in complete control of the action. Most enemies will explode with a satisfying crunch when they're defeated, giving the combat a distinct, punchy, visceral feel. Giving the player visual feedback to their button presses is where I feel the game really excels, and it's something I wish was given more thought in other games. Almost every single button press has an obvious visual response on screen, with my favourite example being how Samus rests her hand onto her arm cannon when you press the right trigger, making looking around feel more steady and deliberate. Small touches like this are what give Prime great game feel, and it's a good example of how video games can use their interactive nature to create a unique piece of entertainment. Anyway, finding the wave beam grants access to the Space Pirate research labs in Phendrana, and it's here that the story begins to gain some momentum. The journey through the laboratories is loosely structured as a linear set piece that sees you fighting through hallways crawling with space pirates, and it's not too long before you first encounter a Metroid. I love the way Metroids are introduced here. The absence of music during the cutscene is a great way to convey a feeling of caution, so even if you have no idea what this thing is, you're bound to feel slightly uneasy. To fans of the series who know what Metroids are capable of, the revelation that space pirates are trying to enhance them with Phazon is truly terrifying. This feeling of dread is reflected in Samus's behaviour. She doesn't try to engage it in any way, she just watches it from a safe distance. Scanning the Metroid triggers it to break out of its containment tube and a frantic battle ensues. It's a wonderful moment that manages to keep its impact even on repeat playthroughs. A nice touch to this area is that you can actually break the Metroids out of their test tubes and they'll attack nearby space pirates. I'd love to say that this adds some layer of strategy to the combat, but if I'm honest, it's just fun to watch. Once you've been acquainted with Metroids, it's not long until you reach the end of the research complex where you'll find the thermal visor. Collecting the visor plunges the laboratories into darkness, and you're forced to use your new thermal vision to escape. It's a nice idea that perfectly demonstrates how the thermal visor is used, but I feel it slightly overstays its welcome. The garish bright yellows, reds and purples can prove eye-straining after a while, and I think if this section had been limited to one room, it would have achieved the same goal. The visor upgrades are an interesting addition to the game, and both the thermal and X-ray visors see a fair amount of use throughout the course of a single playthrough. Their inclusion fits in perfectly with the first-person perspective, and this is one of my favourite aspects of the game. With a few notable exceptions, many first-person shooters have the player assume the role of a camera with a gun attached to it. Metroid Prime fully embraces its first-person perspective, and we as players are looking directly through Samus's visor. This is exactly how she's seeing the world, and it makes for some incredibly immersive gameplay. Walking through hot areas causes her visor to steam up, certain enemies will interfere with her heads-up display, and glaring lights from explosions and energy blasts will show Samus's face reflected in her visor. Retro Studios clearly went to great lengths to really put you in the shoes of Samus, and these details make the experience wonderfully authentic. Once you've escaped from the research complex with the thermal visor, it's on to the next boss fight. After a somewhat lackluster fight against Flagra, the battle against Thardus is a nice change of pace. Defeating this enormous Phazon-infused monster is a frantic struggle that requires the use of pretty much every upgrade you've acquired so far. You're switching between visors, firing missiles, and boost balling around the arena. It feels as though you're giving everything you've got to bring Thardus down, and it's a shining example of what fighting a boss should feel like. Thardus rewards the Spider Ball, which adds even more utility to the basic Morph Ball. This is a returning feature from Metroid 2, and it comes with one major change. In Metroid 2, the Spider Ball was able to stick to practically any surface and opened up the game map in a huge way. In Metroid Prime, you're limited to magnetized railings. I'd imagine that having the Spider Ball stick to every surface in a completely 3D environment would have been difficult to develop and would have also run the risk of becoming game-breaking. Being able to climb any wall would make the platforming mostly pointless, and much of the fun of traversing the game's landscapes would be removed. To use the Spider Ball, the right trigger must be pressed and held down. Releasing the trigger causes the ball to detach from the rail and drop to the floor. This may seem like an arbitrary design choice, but I feel it was deliberate. Having to hold and release the trigger allows for some interesting puzzles that incorporate a small level of dexterity into their solutions. A great example of this is the puzzle leading up to the plasma beam in Magmoor caverns. Navigating this complex series of spiderball tracks requires the player to let go of the trigger and push it down a split second afterwards. A mistimed trigger press means the player is thrown off the tracks and has to start the puzzle again. This rewards quick reactions and forward thinking, and these puzzles wouldn't have been possible if the spiderball was controlled with a toggle like it is in Metroid 2. As a small side note, I like how holding down the trigger makes it feel as though you're actually clinging to the railings. This probably wasn't intentional, but I've always felt that it makes using the spiderball a bit more interactive. With the spiderball, you can now access the Hall of Elders back in Chozo ruins, and it's here that you'll first encounter the Chozo ghosts. Initially, fighting the ghosts is pretty intense. They flicker in and out of existence, dart around the room, and stun you with blasts of energy. However, once you learn that they go down with a couple of super missiles, they become nothing more than a minor annoyance. What's more is that you don't even have to fight them, and you can simply run through to the next room unharmed. I do like that they appear in certain rooms throughout the ruins, and on my first playthrough I actually thought the rooms they spawned in were random. It gave this layer of tension going back through the ruins, and I was always on edge anticipating an encounter with the ghosts. On subsequent playthroughs I eventually realised that they only appear in a select few rooms, which removed the tension, but even so I still think they're a nice addition. The Hall of Elders itself is an interesting room, and it makes great use of the beam weapons. 3 coloured slots are embedded into the wall at the back of the room, representing the wave, ice and plasma beams. These bomb slots can only be used once they've been activated with their respective beam, and each one causes a large panel to rotate in the centre of the room. Each rotation leads the player to 3 different rewards, eventually leading to a Chozo artifact. This means that each time the player obtains a new beam, they'll be reminded to come back to the Hall of Elders and activate a new bomb slot. The room is gradually solved as the game progresses, and it's a simple but effective method of using the player's intrigue to keep them coming back to a room to solve its puzzles and uncover its secrets. The first rotation leads to the second weapon upgrade, the Ice Beam. With a slow fire rate and a long travel time, the Ice Beam isn't ideal for frantic combat situations, but it makes dealing with most enemies much easier. A charged shot will freeze enemies solid, shattering into pieces if followed up with a missile. In addition to freezing enemies, using the Ice Beam on the flame vents in Magmoor caverns will encase them in ice, meaning you can pass by them unharmed. This makes backtracking through the caverns slightly more streamlined, since you're not stopping in your tracks to wait until it's safe to walk through. You can simply freeze them over and carry on at a brisk pace. Before you can go on to explore the Phazon mines, there's a small journey back to Phendrana to grab the gravity suit. Going back here with the Ice Beam grants access to Phendrana's Edge, a new area that lets the player delve into the more secluded and isolated caverns of Phendrana. The discovery of this new area is accompanied by a remix of Phendrana Drift's main theme, with its delicate piano notes and atmospheric synths. Being revitalized with more upbeat, bass-heavy electronic elements. The lead up to the gravity suit involves moving through areas that are submersed in water. Samus's speed is reduced to a crawl and visibility is relatively limited, which makes finding the gravity suit all the more satisfying. With this new suit upgrade, the player can now freely move through water unhindered, and their vision underwater is completely clear. This enhanced mobility underwater allows the player to go back and explore the large lake in Talon overworld, where the space pirate frigate from the beginning of the game has crashed and been reduced to scrap metal. Talon 4's efficient ecosystem has quickly adapted and grown around the destroyed frigate, with bioluminescent moss clinging to its damp metal corridors and small crabs taking residence inside various hatches and tunnels. Having the player explore the ruins of the research station is a great example of narrative consistency, and it neatly ties up the events that transpired at the beginning of the game. It would have been easy to design the research station as nothing more than a disposable tutorial level, something the developers used to get the core mechanics of the game stuck in the player's head before writing it out of existence using, a self-destruct sequence. Retro Studios went the extra mile and used the destruction of the frigate to create an entire level that you could then go on to explore. It also helps to keep you grounded and invested in the game's story. Metroid Prime's open world structure means it runs the risk of its narrative growing cold. A player may spend hours exploring before they suddenly realise they have no idea why they're exploring in the first place. The game prevents this from happening by having 2 layers to its story, one layer being made up of events that the player has to witness, and the other layer being made up of things that the player may choose to learn in the form of scan logs. The best way I can think of to explain this is to break down the story from the perspective of 2 hypothetical players. The first layer consists of cutscenes and set pieces that set the basic structure of the game's plot. To a player that completely ignores the data found by scanning, Samus approached the space pirate frigate to investigate a distress signal. She explored the research station, triggering it to self-destruct when she defeated the Parasite Queen. Whilst escaping the frigate, she encountered Ridley, who she then chased down onto Talon 4. From here, the motivation for the player to explore is to regain their strength and hunt down Ridley. In doing so, Samus discovers that the space pirates have been performing experiments on Metroids. Delving deeper into Talon 4 reveals that the space pirates have also been experimenting on their own species, presumably using this strange blue substance that becomes increasingly prevalent in the planet's environments. This all culminates with the player finally hunting down Ridley and defeating him. Then there's the fight with Metroid Prime itself, which probably doesn't make sense to this hypothetical person, but either way it's a cool looking monster and a great way to end the game. To a player that fully invests themselves in the game's lore, they learn of the complex nature of Phazon, the highly radioactive and mutagenic substance that the space pirates have been messing with. They learn that the Chozo tried to turn Talon 4 into a sanctuary, moving away from technology and growing closer to nature. They discover that a meteor crashed into the planet, unleashing a poison that twisted the environment and its creatures. Eventually, they learn that this poison was Phazon, and that the living source of the Phazon has been locked inside the impact crater by the Chozo. As foretold by the Chozo, Samus arrives on Talon 4 and ends up becoming powerful enough to destroy the source itself, which is revealed to be Metroid Prime. Both of these players are being told a story, but one player gets a richer narrative experience than the other. The cutscenes and set pieces serve as occasional pokes and prods to keep the story moving, and the optional scannable information adds depth and consistency should the player want it. Much like many other aspects of the game, it's carefully designed to appeal to several kinds of players, but it doesn't necessarily favour one over the other. They simply have a slightly different experience. This may be why there's a separate completion percentage for logbook entries and item pickups. Players that favour getting all of the items over scanning still have a percentage to monitor their progress, and vice versa. Bringing this point back to the crashed research station, it's a part of the game's story that both kinds of players are familiar with. Both players began their journey on the frigate, and they both know it was destroyed. Whether you've been following the lore at this point doesn't matter. Discovering the ruins of the research station piques the interest of both players and encourages them to continue exploring. This area serves as a transition between the Talon overworld and the final area of the game, the Phazon mines. With its chunky metal corridors and heavy mining equipment, the Phazon mines stand in stark contrast to the relatively natural environments that have been seen up to this point. The space pirates' influence on the planet was seen in the research labs in Phendrana and some areas of Magmoor caverns, but it's in the mines that their Phazon harvesting and experiments become most apparent. A gritty industrial soundscape pulses with a low tempo, providing the perfect backdrop for the darker, more subdued colour palette of the machinery embedded into rock. With quick and easy access to large deposits of Phazon in the mines, it's here that the results of the biological experiments come to full fruition in the form of elite pirates. Enhanced and driven mad by Phazon, these huge mutated versions of space pirates are daunting to fight. They tower over Samus, absorbing her weapon blast and unleashing shockwaves that cause a fair amount of damage. They're also equipped with an artillery cannon which can be targeted using the thermal visor and destroyed with missiles. It would have been interesting if this concept was applied to more enemies in the game. There's something satisfying about systematically defeating an enemy by wearing down its armor and weapons. It's not required to take down the elite pirates, but destroying their artillery cannon puts the player at an advantage in the encounter. Much like the fight against Stardust, it feels as though you're using your equipment strategically to overcome challenges. It gets you into the head of Samus and makes you feel like a bounty hunter. You'll also discover that it's not just Phazon the space pirates have been experimenting with. They've also been reverse engineering Samus's weapon technology, resulting in space pirates that use your own beam weapons against you. It's an interesting if minor addition to the core combat, asking the player to switch beams depending on the colour of the enemy they're fighting. It also teaches the player that matching the colours of their beam weapons deals damage, which is a core component of the final boss fight against Metroid Prime later on. The Phazon mines contains lots of interesting pieces of pirate data to scan, with one of my favourites being one that simply states, "Report any signs of ration rejection by elite pirates at once." This small sentence communicates a lot about the nature of Phazon and helps to establish just how brutal exposure to it can be. Space pirates are a power-hungry species, going to extreme lengths to take control of entire planets. For a species so focused on power, it says a lot that they're rejecting something as powerful as Phazon because of the extreme pain they must endure during the mutation process. It shows that some of these pirates are suffering and adds a bit of dimension to them as characters. Until this point in the series, space pirates were nothing but cannon fodder, two-dimensional brutes that got in your way and were fun to shoot. With the introduction of Metroid Prime's scan data, they became more fleshed out and are actually depicted as being quite intelligent. Amongst their ranks of foot soldiers and brutes, they have divisions of scientists and researchers performing complex biological experiments, as well as reverse engineering technology to further their cause. Their thirst for power isn't lost in all of this though. Their reckless disregard for safety and the fact that they torture their own kind in the name of science makes them an effective antagonist. On a slightly lighter note, there's an amusing piece of pirate data explaining how they've unsuccessfully attempted to reverse engineer Samus's morph ball technology. It details how their test subjects were horribly mutilated and twisted when they tried to use the morph ball prototypes. It's a great piece of dark humour and a subtle nod to anyone who's seen Samus using the morph ball and wondered how the hell she manages to do it. The Phazon mines is also where I'd say the game becomes more challenging. The introduction of the stronger beam troopers and of course the elite pirates means that this area has a relatively sharp difficulty spike. There's a fairly sized gap between save stations here too. The first save station in this area is at the entrance, and there isn't another chance to save until you reach the power bomb upgrade sometime after. On my first playthrough, this is one of the few times that I died, and it was frustrating to have to go all the way back through the mines before I reached the next save station. This was only frustrating because the game up until this point had been fairly easy as far as combat was concerned, and I guess I just wasn't mentally prepared to suddenly be challenged in this way. In a more general sense though, if Metroid Prime's difficulty was measured by how many times the average player died in the course of a single playthrough, it would probably be considered an incredibly easy game. Playing on normal difficulty, I'd say the average first-time player might see the game over screen no more than 3 or 4 times, and that's being generous. However, I think it's important to realise that this isn't an objectively bad thing. Metroid Prime's combat isn't difficult because it doesn't need to be. The Metroid series has never focused on challenging the player in this way, and instead the focus is on exploration. Letting the player loose to explore and uncover secrets within a large interconnected map is what I consider to be the core of what Metroid is all about. The challenge comes from memorising where you can't go, and then remembering to come back there once you have the means to bypass that barrier. It rewards the player for thinking carefully about their surroundings rather than punishing them for poor combat skills. For this review, I played through Metroid Prime on hard mode all the way through, although I didn't capture footage of it, so you'll just have to take my word for it. Being used to the game's normal difficulty, I was surprised by how challenging hard mode was, but at no point did I feel as though I was playing a game designed to be played this way. Enemies simply took more hits and dealt more damage, and bosses in particular were incredibly bullet spongy. To add to this, there seemed to be a deliberate lack of health drops, with crates dropping an abundance of missile ammunition instead. There were moments where I'd be desperately low on health, breaking every box I could find only to be given missiles from my already full missile reserves. Obviously this did raise the stakes, but it felt as if the game was actively working against me rather than challenging me fairly. This kind of intense level of play certainly has its place, and there are games designed entirely around this concept that manage to thrive on their difficulty. I don't feel that Metroid Prime was ever meant to be one of these games, and as a result, hard mode feels like an afterthought. It's for this reason that I think hard mode can't be unlocked until you've played through the game on normal difficulty first. A brand new player playing on hard mode may become too focused on overcoming enemies and rushing through to the next save point, rather than taking the time to explore and uncover the small secrets that have been carefully placed around the map. Having hard mode unavailable at first means that all players will play through the game as intended at least once. Despite all this, I think it's nice that hard mode is in there. For someone like myself who has played through Metroid Prime countless times, it's a nice addition that provides a challenge to shake things up a little. Getting back to the Phazon mines then, the first visit here may be initially difficult, but your efforts are rewarded with the power bomb upgrade. This powerful alternative to the standard morph ball bomb has a much larger area of effect and packs a substantial punch, and it can make dealing with larger groups of enemies much easier. Unlike the regular bomb, the power bomb has limited ammunition and must be used sparingly. This limitation is obviously to prevent the player from spamming it. If this were possible, it would make any enemy encounter a joke. The problem is that the power bomb is also used to destroy certain obstacles. There have been a couple of times where I've spent ages backtracking to an area to grab an upgrade only to discover that I've run out of power bombs. Its ammunition is relatively scarce, so you're better off going back to your ship on Talon overworld to completely restore your reserves. This can double the amount of time it takes to get a simple health or missile upgrade, although with that said, it's probably just a lack of resourcefulness on my part. Going back through the mines with the power bomb enables the player to fully complete the rotating spider ball pillar that was used earlier, allowing them to climb the pillar and pick up the grapple beam. This works surprisingly well in first person, and crossing gaps using the grapple hooks is pretty intuitive. It's a shame that it doesn't get more use throughout the game, but the few places where you can use it are always fun. With these 2 new power-ups found, that wraps up the first visit to the Phazon mines, and it's back to the Talon overworld to find the X-ray visor. This visor upgrade originally debuted in Super Metroid, where the player could use their X-ray vision to see through walls and special blocks that hid secrets and upgrades. It functions very much in the same way in Metroid Prime, although its most useful function is the ability to see Chozo ghosts even when they're phasing. It also reveals a few hidden platforms that you can jump on to reach a few missile upgrades. A wonderful touch to the X-ray visor is that you can see through Samus's armor, revealing her skeleton. Look closely and you'll see that she changes her hand position depending on what beam you're using, and her fingers will match the corresponding beam icon. It's a small detail, but I love that Retro put this in the game. The small hand icons representing the different beams always struck me as strange, and noticing the hand positions with the X-ray visor made it click into place. It shows that some consideration was put into how Samus's suit functions, and makes her a more believable character as a result. Before heading back to the Phazon mines, there's a small detour to Magmoor caverns to grab the final weapon upgrade. I spoke highly of this puzzle before, so I won't repeat myself. It's a great use of the spider ball, and the puzzle itself is introduced amazingly. Spinning all of the platforms into place and using the morph ball slot at the top causes a whole portion of the room to shift upwards, revealing the tracks. Reaching the end of the puzzle rewards the plasma beam. This is the most powerful weapon in the game, reducing many enemies to simple one-hit kills. Being the final weapon you'll find, it makes sense that it's pretty overpowered. It's a nice reward for getting this far and makes backtracking much smoother. It also melts thick layers of ice in Phendrana to gain access to some energy and missile upgrades, making it practical as well as powerful. With all 4 beam weapons, every door in the game can now be opened, and the Phazon mines can be fully explored. Deep within the mines, the Space Pirate's most powerful weapon sleeps in its stasis tank. Upon seeing Samus, the Omega Pirate bursts out of its confines and the boss fight begins. This takes everything that was great about the Thardus fight and expands on it, making for an intense struggle that forces you to use everything at your disposal to overcome it. What I love about the Omega Pirate is that it has a very distinct pattern, but the frantic nature of the arena helps to disguise the repetition. It feels like an actual battle as opposed to a methodical by-the-numbers boss. The player must first shatter the pirate's armor whilst avoiding damage from its shockwaves and shoulder-mounted cannons. Once it's been weakened, it will become invisible and move to one of the nearby Phazon pools to regain its strength. During this phase, waves of beam troopers enter the arena, so your focus has to be divided between fighting off the reinforcements and using your X-ray visor to look for the Omega Pirate. The music here really sells the tension, with the industrial ambience of the Phazon mines transforming into an aggressive melody, steadily rising in tone to put the player on edge. Simply put, it's a fantastic boss fight. With the Omega Pirate defeated, you're granted the Phazon suit in one of the most badass cutscenes I've ever seen. The Phazon suit provides immunity to Phazon damage, which is demonstrated by the health and ammo dropped by the boss being unaffected by the charge beam. This forces the player to walk into the pool of Phazon where they'll notice they no longer take damage from it. This is the final upgrade obtained in the game, and you're now strong enough to take on Ridley and Metroid Prime. Before you can go on to fight these bosses though, you must first find the 12 Chozo artifacts in order to gain access to the impact crater back on the Talon overworld. This is perhaps the most heavily criticised part of Metroid Prime, and it's easy to see why. After spending so much time exploring, getting stronger, and eagerly anticipating the final boss encounters, it can be discouraging to learn that your progress is locked behind a decently sized scavenger hunt. It can feel like superficial padding to extend the game's runtime, and at its worst it can add as much as 2 hours of backtracking before the player can fight the last 2 bosses. Although I can appreciate why so many people dislike this section of the game, I personally don't mind it. You can access the artifact temple as soon as you've got the missile launcher, so you can start hunting for the artifacts near the beginning of the game. I'm fairly certain the reason the developers let you into this room so early is so that players could hunt for the artifacts alongside playing the game at its usual pace. If you're particularly observant and curious, you'll likely have most of the artifacts before reaching this section of the game. You can scan the pillars inside the temple to gather clues that let you know where the artifacts are hidden. These clues aren't exactly subtle and pretty much directly instruct the player where to find the artifacts, with key rooms and phrases being highlighted in the logbook. It's also a chance to go back through the game and pick up any collectibles you may have missed. You're going to want to have as much health and missiles as possible to bring down the final bosses, and it's also a final chance to increase your completion percentage if you're into that sort of thing. I also see this section as a kind of final send-off to Talon 4, one last journey through the environments you've spent so much time exploring before the game is over and the credits roll. It's a chance to let everything sink in and experience a moment of calm exploration before diving back into the intense final boss encounters. With all 12 artifacts found, it's time to head back to the Artifact Temple and delve into the impact crater to destroy the source of the Phazon. Returning to the temple causes the ancient pillars and statues to fade into life as the now fully formed key begins to open the lock that separates you from Metroid Prime. Before it can complete its process, Meta Ridley appears from the clouds in an attempt to ambush Samus and prevent her from entering the crater. It's finally time to take down the commander of the space pirates. Fighting Ridley amongst the ruins of an ancient Chozo temple with heavy rain and fog filling the air makes for an exciting atmosphere. The music for this fight is a great reconstruction of Ridley's signature theme from Super Metroid, which is rather appropriate when you consider that Ridley himself has been reconstructed too. Augmented with space pirate technology, he has a variety of weapons at his disposal, including missiles, explosives, and plasma-based breath attacks. The first phase of this fight is fairly slow and largely consists of waiting for Ridley to expose the weak point on his chest. Considering this is a boss that's been teased since the beginning of the game, I think the pace of this phase misses the mark. His attacks don't deal much damage, and it's just a case of letting him fly around the arena before hovering still for a few moments. It's the second phase where this fight reaches its peak. His wings begin to burn up, forcing him to land on the temple floor and fight Samus in close quarters combat. Finally getting up close and personal with Ridley is as frightening as it is cathartic, with the finer details of his menacing design coming into full view. The player has to time their shots just right to hit Ridley's mouth, stunning him and exposing his weak point. There's a nice sense of rhythm to this phase as you dash around the arena avoiding his breath attacks and claw swipes. Dealing the final blow to his chest ends the fight, and Ridley is defeated by the temple itself in one final act of vengeance by the Chozo. With Ridley taken care of, the door to the impact crater is opened, with Metroid Prime waiting inside.
Impact crater.
The use of a voice announcing the impact crater is a nice touch that helps to establish an endgame atmosphere. For whatever reason, this voice is only present in the European version of the game, which is a shame because it's a small but effective way of building up some anticipation for what lies ahead. The impact crater itself is a beautifully designed area, a bizarre, twisted organic landscape that feels completely alien, with its deep oranges and dark browns making the player feel thoroughly uninvited and out of place. The surreal landscape is brought to life with ambient synths that bubble and writhe with uncomfortable inconsistency. The short journey through here is unsettling and sets the tone for the final boss brilliantly. After some brief platforming, you're faced with the door to Metroid Prime's chamber, and the final battle begins. The battle against Metroid Prime is split into two distinct phases that manage to make use of every single upgrade you've acquired, and it's a great final test of the player's skill. Its first form is a spider-like creature encased in an armoured shell, able to throw out attacks based on Samus's beam weapons. Much like the beam troopers, the player must change their weapon to correspond with Metroid Prime's colour, all whilst dodging its various projectile and beam attacks. Once the monstrous appearance of Prime has sunk in, this phase is fairly straightforward. Its attacks are nicely telegraphed, and you're able to see the colour it's using even from the furthest distance away. Once enough damage has been dealt to Prime's outer carapace, it stumbles backwards and falls deeper into the impact crater. Samus follows it down to finish the fight. It crawls out of its weakened shell, revealing its true form. There's something unsettling about the fact that this form has a vaguely human face. It gives it a much more expressive design and hints that there's a higher intelligence behind its initially insect-like appearance. It reminds me of the creatures described in the works of H.P. Lovecraft, monsters living deep within the earth and its oceans that behave in ways beyond our understanding. In this form, Prime is only vulnerable to blasts of pure Phazon, which Samus can now unleash thanks to her Phazon suit. Standing in the pools of Phazon put down by Prime activates Hyper Mode, allowing you to open fire on the creature and cause large amounts of damage. It shifts around all visual spectrums, forcing you to make use of both a thermal and X-ray visor to track it down. This phase isn't too challenging, but it doesn't need to be. The more complex first form tested your skills, and to bring down Metroid Prime in this final satisfying section is your reward. After taking enough punishment from Samus's Phazon blasts, Metroid Prime becomes unstable, reducing it to a floating, amorphous blob. In a last-ditch effort to kill Samus, it latches onto her suit, only managing to rip the Phazon suit away before collapsing in on itself, bringing the entire impact crater with it. Metroid Prime is defeated, and Samus makes her escape, bringing the game to a close.
Chozo's faith in Samus has been well rewarded, and now a new star shines in the universe. The bounty hunter, Samus Aran. What future and fate await her?
Before I wrap up the review, I want to briefly talk about an interesting statistic. My first playthrough of Metroid Prime took 28 hours from start to finish. The playthrough you've been watching took just over 7 hours. This means that on my first time through, I spent roughly 20 hours making very little progress, getting lost and figuring things out, and I loved every second of it. I think it speaks volumes about the quality of a game when I'm happy to spend this long simply wandering and losing myself within its world. Metroid Prime is a game that has impressive moments of spectacle, and equally impressive tiny details and final touches. It's these small details that make the game so immersive and intriguing. It's a game that I consistently revisit, and it always captures my imagination much in the same way it did when I first sat down to explore Talon 4 and uncover its secrets. I consider Metroid Prime to be a masterpiece, and I feel it holds up remarkably well even 14 years after its release. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next video.